Did you know that the forgotten founder of Zionism went on to play a leading role in Agudas Yisrael, or that Rav Chatzkel Abramsky was responsible for the continued presence of the Muslim Waqf on Har HaBayis? It turns out that the margins of history tell the real story. Behind the Times dives into the big concepts and overlooked moments that carry vast meaning, all through the lens of Torah and rabbinic thought. Join me, Gedalia Guttentag, as I go behind the Times to explore the forgotten history, remarkable personalities, and transformative moments that shape current events and explain how we got here. Behind the Times with Gedalia Guttentag.
The year is 1189. The knight stands atop Beaufort Castle, gazing out over the green valleys of southern Lebanon. Below him, the Litani River winds through the landscape. Beyond it lie the lands of his enemies. Somewhere out there, Saladin's armies are gathering. The wagon approaches in the distance, kicking up a cloud of dust. The knight watches for a moment, then relaxes. These aren't soldiers, just a merchant. A Jewish merchant at that, from one of the towns of the Galilee, bringing supplies to the garrison. The knight scarcely notices him. To the Crusaders, the Jews are a defeated people. Little does the Crusader knight know that 9 centuries later, it will be Jewish soldiers who occupy these same walls. And that's where our story begins. Because Beaufort Castle has just been captured once again by the IDF. Its recapture has unleashed a remarkable wave of memory in Israel. Veterans of the famous 1982 battle, during which the IDF took the Beaufort Castle from the PLO, have returned to television studios. Former commanders are once again debating what the mountain means in terms of Israel's security. And perhaps that's why the mountain still resonates. Because Beaufort, which means a beautiful fortress in French, is not merely a Crusader castle. It's a place where centuries of history have piled up on that same ridge. It's a fortress built by the Crusader kings, and it overlooks the river that Zionist leaders once hoped would mark the northern frontier of a future Jewish state. It's a border that was actually drawn by imperial officers in Bedouin robes, with little more than survey maps and pencils. And Beaufort Castle lies atop a mountain over which Israelis continue to argue about some of the deepest questions of national security, such as, why does Israel keep finding itself drawn back into Lebanon? Did the withdrawal of 2000 solve a problem, or just postpone it? And can technology replace geography? In other words, does holding high ground still matter? And this, my dear listeners, is the story of Beaufort. To understand Beaufort, we need to understand why anyone built a fortress there in the first place. The story begins in the aftermath of the First Crusade. In 1099, Crusader armies captured Jerusalem and established a Christian kingdom in the Holy Land, known as the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Conquering the kingdom was easier than keeping it, because the Crusaders were a small minority led by bands of elite knights who formed orders such as the Knights Hospitallers and the Knights Templars, who gave us their iconic kind of vision what we have of these Crusader knights in their clanking chainmail, massively heavily armored with their war horses, and over their chainmail they had these white robes with the red Christian cross emblazoned on it. And that's our vision of the Knights Templars and Hospitallers, who had slightly different uniforms. But they had these elite knights who were tasked with maintaining Christian rule over essentially what these areas of the Middle East. They were a tiny minority ruling over a region populated overwhelmingly by others, by Muslims and Eastern Christians. There were small Jewish communities scattered there. I think in Jewish terms we have to remember this is the age between Rashi and the Rambam. And obviously Jews had long since ceased holding political power. The Crusaders found themselves suddenly responsible for defending a kingdom along the Mediterranean seaboard that was long and thin and it was underpopulated by the conquerors, by the Crusaders, and it was surrounded by enemies. The man who confronted this reality in the 12th century was a man called King Fulk of Anjou. Anjou is a place, was actually a province in western France, centered on the city of Angers in the beautiful Loire Valley, which is filled with castles and is a very, very beautiful part of the country. King Fulk arrives there in the Holy Land, and actually it's important to know that Fulk of Anjou, they gave their name, the Angevin dynasty, who ruled England in that time. Essentially, another branch of the family ruled as that dynasty ruled England. But anyway, Fulk was a successful military commander who had mastered and held down territory in his native region in France, and he arrives through dynastic marriage to take possession of the Kingdom of Jerusalem as King of Jerusalem in the Holy Land in 1129. And so the realm that he inherits looks impressive on the map, but is actually very fragile because it's long and thin. It is beset by enemies to the north and to the south, surrounded essentially on all sides really, by Muslim enemies. You had the Fatimid Egypt to the south, and you had Aleppo and Mosul to the north and east. Essentially, this long, thin region, or rather realm, is fragile. So what he knows is that as long as the Muslims are divided, then fine. Then the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem is okay. But he worries about when they combine. So what does he do? Fulk does what frontier rulers throughout history have done. When they have to hold a region, an area that is threatened, they seek to replace manpower with fortresses. And lots of them. And the Crusaders obviously didn't have armies to station everywhere. But if you have a castle, you have a strong point, it can guard a crossing or watch a road, and it can dominate the key terrain around with relatively few troops. Going up on the road to Yerushalayim from the coastal area, from Beit Shemesh or from Tel Aviv area, you're going to come past a big intersection over there, before Mavaseret, which is the Ein Chemed interchange. And for those who, if you go off the road, you'll see Ein Chemed, known in Latin as Aqua Bella, beautiful water. And there's a beautifully preserved Crusader stronghold there. It's not a castle, it's kind of a big fortified farmhouse or something. And you can see the scale of the military engineering there. But the Crusaders did, on a far larger scale, they built castles everywhere. Some of them still stand bits and pieces. Near today's Beit Shemesh, you have the Beit Guvrin, which you can see from the road as you go past fortifications there. Near Ashdod, there was a place called Blanche Garde, which means white guard. It seems to have been based on the rocky outcrop that it stood on. That's where they had something, and that was guarding the fact that in Ascalon, or Ashkelon as we call it, it was a Fatimid Egyptian outpost or town over there. So they needed to have something to block the road into the hinterland of the Crusader territory. And near Yavne there was another castle as well. Far to the north, above the Litani River in what's now Lebanon, stood Beaufort. And if you stand on Beaufort today, you can understand why someone would choose that spot. So below is the Litani River, and there's roads and crosses. And so the fortress was not built just because it was a beautiful fortress. It was built because whoever sat on that mountain could see trouble coming. King Fulk of Jerusalem and Anjou believed that castles could compensate for weakness. Unfortunately for King Fulk's strategy, an Iraqi general named Imad ad-Din Zengi, who's a founder of the Zengi dynasty, he was about to test it. He was based in Mosul and Aleppo, and Iraq, Syria today. And Zengi began the process of unifying Muslim power against the Crusader states, which had been the nightmare of Crusader rulers. And after him came his son, Nur ad-Din, and then Nur ad-Din gave way to one of his soldiers and generals who eventually seized power, was Saladin, who wasn't Iraqi, he was Kurdish, and obviously one of the great Muslim military leaders of all the ages. And they achieved what King Fulk had so much feared, because they unified and attacked the Crusader kingdoms. And what happened in 1187, it all came to a head at a battle called the Horns of Hattin, or Karnechitin, which is just north of today's kibbutz Lavi. If you stand there in the kibbutz, you'll see two little in a kind of very empty hill country over there. You look more to Tveria, I think it's. You can see these two little eminences. That's where the great clash of the Crusaders and Saladin actually happened. Because what happens at that battle, Saladin destroys the main Crusader army, disaster for the Crusaders. It leads to Jerusalem itself falling. And that's the end of, or very much a low point in Crusader history. And obviously Richard the Lionheart, etc., comes afterwards as well. And that's going forward. But what happens is that even as the Crusader state collapsed, Beaufort remained. The Crusaders hadn't been wrong. Castles did matter, and the high ground mattered, and the frontier mattered. The problem was there wasn't enough power to sustain them. And as I thought about this, researched this particular episode, I found myself thinking how familiar this sounds, because Israel faces a series of separate threats. The Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, Shiite militias in Syria and Iraq, and you have the Houthis in Yemen. Although all different organizations are all funded by one network, all Iranian network funded by Tehran. And obviously the Iranians are not Saladin, the IDF is not, Baruch Hashem, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. But the strategic problem would be recognized by King Fulk. How does a small frontier state survive when separate enemies begin acting together? Before we leave Beaufort for the battlefields of modern Lebanon, it's worth looking down once again from the castle walls at what lies below, because flowing far beneath the fortress is the Litani River. To understand why this region has mattered so long, we need to forget for a minute the modern map on which Israel and Lebanon have the kind of two sovereign states, and they have defined borders separated by, and that's contested borders. But essentially, we need to forget all of that, because we have to understand that border is basically a century old. Most of its history, that's not how this region operated. You have to think of the Mediterranean seaboard as one long continuum. The Crusaders, obviously, with Fulk's Kingdom of Jerusalem, had the border of Jerusalem as far north as they could, which was at the Litani. But actually, if you looked north, you would have seen there was other Crusader states, right? The areas of Tripoli and Antioch and Edessa, these were ruled by other Crusader kings and counts and princes, etc. And the coast, they viewed the coast as one long strategic world. And Beaufort was just one fortress in a much larger system. Well, Lahavdil, if you look through the eyes of the Torah, also the Lebanese border, even the Syrian border, these are meaningless terms, because Avraham Avinu is told that his descendants are going to have a country or possessions until the great river, the Euphrates River. And if you look where the actual border of Eretz Yisrael, which was never achieved but is promised for the future, it stretches all the way to Turkey and what's the current Syrian-Turkish border. And back in the 14th century, there was the great Ishtori HaParchi, who was one of the Rishonim of the authored Kaftava Farach, which was the first great halachic survey of Eretz Yisrael. And Ishtori HaParchi traveled across the country and collected old traditions and tried to understand and to build a geographic and halachic picture of the Gvulos of Eretz Yisrael. And according to his, it's clear that all of up to the Litani River, even further north, these are all parts of Eretz Yisrael, even in a halachic sense, meaning they were conquered later by those who came from Bavel, or perhaps before they came from Mitzrayim, even without reference to the promises given to Avraham Avinu, which is far larger. In other words, a conception of Eretz Yisrael where the borders are need to totally change. So what happened is that the modern frontier actually, fascinatingly, only emerged after the First World War. So the Ottoman Empire, which was long held to be the sick man of Europe, finally gave up the ghost. And it was European officials led by France and Britain, who were imperial overlords, who basically dismembered the corpse of the Ottoman Empire and carved it up between themselves. So many people have heard of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which were the two British and French diplomats who in 1916 redrew the maps of the modern Middle East. And as is well known, They literally drew, in a kind of brutal carve-up of the region, they redrew the map of the area by using these colored pencils and basically delineating different spheres of influence. And when it got down to it, the width of the pencil used on one of these military maps would have meant that the delineated wide borders. But these borders made no sense. If you look at some of the super arrow straight borders of places like Saudi Arabia, you understand they have no reference to geography or to the tribes who roamed and continued to roam freely across the borders. In the Middle East, in the desert, no one knows where a line is in the sand of the desert, but Sykes-Picot did that, and it caused basically decades and a century of chaos afterwards. But that's Sykes-Picot. Other people don't remember later on another man called Stuart Newcomb, who was so close to the feel of a British colonial officer as to be almost absurd. And there's pictures of him in Bedouin robes and gives us a sense of who he was. He was a great friend of Lawrence of Arabia. And Newcomb spends years roaming around the deserts of the Middle East, and he helps to actually pin down what's actually the frontier between Lebanon and Palestine. And one of the big questions facing the British and French map makers, Colonel Stuart Newcomb and his French opposite number, was, what do you do about the Litani? Who does it belong to, Lebanon, or does it belong to Palestine? So it's not just a question of carving up relative spheres of influence between Britain and France, because France, people have forgotten, as there was a British mandate for Palestine given by the League of Nations, the same act of the League of Nations gave a French mandate to Lebanon. And it wasn't just a question of geography, it was actually a question of water. Because today, we know that Israel is self-sufficient, it has desalination plants and water technology, but in the early 20th century, Zionist leaders such as Chaim Weizmann said that if we do not have access to enough water, we will not be able to sustain the growing Jewish population of Palestine. And so Chaim Weizmann arrives in 1919 at the Paris Peace Conference and comes up with a map, and he said the northern border of Palestine should be drawn much further north than it eventually is. And he said it should be slightly south of Sidon, on the coast of today's Lebanon, running east across southern Lebanon, and in other words, just next to and including the Litani River Basin. And he says that memorandum, which is obviously part of the archives of the United Nations, says the economic life of Palestine depends upon its water supply for irrigation and for the production of electric power. And they said in the same memorandum, the Har Hermon, is Palestine's real father of waters, cannot be severed from it without striking at the very root of its economic life. And later, actually, Weizmann was to write to British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, and he was in the period of the Balfour Declaration. Remember, this is just 2 years after the Balfour Declaration. He says that the Litani was of no value to Lebanon, but of great value to Palestine. And it's incredible to think that if that had been accepted, then the starting point of the state of Israel's borders, in fact, we wouldn't be discussing this today, because the Israeli border would be just south of, would be huge tracts of many kilometers of southern Lebanon. It would be just under Sidon. But the Zionists lost that argument because the French wanted the Litani to be part of Lebanon, and that was it. But that idea never totally disappeared, because Israeli leaders and strategists are constantly thought about water security, about having access to the waters. And since biblical Israel actually includes these lands, the argument was always a more compelling one. But I think one thing to conclude is certain. The Litani became far more than a river. It's like a symbol of something strategic, a something of something biblical. And that's why the Beaufort matters, because the fortress doesn't just overlook, it's not just a high point in southern Lebanon, it overlooks a river that is essentially considered perhaps to be part of biblical Israel. Fast forward hundreds of years, the modern story of Beaufort begins in 1970 when King Hussein of Jordan finally loses patience with Yasser Arafat and his PLO, kicks them out of Jordan, and the PLO heads for Lebanon, which is being racked, torn apart by a bloody civil war, which creates a vacuum, chaos into which step the thousands of terrorists, heavily armed terrorists of the Palestine Liberation Organization.
And that led to a situation in which, as the PLO entrenches itself in southern Lebanon, the area became what Israelis called Fatah land, right? Fatah being the PLO in Ivrit. And today, when Israelis think of Lebanon, you think of Hezbollah. But before Hezbollah, in the 1970s, the early 80s, the real threat came from the PLO. It was the PLO that fired Katyusha rockets at Israel's northern communities. PLO terrorists infiltrated the border, committed the 1974 Ma'alot massacre, the 1978 Coastal Road massacre, in which 38 Israelis, including 13 children, were killed. And so it was clear to Israeli planners that as the 1970s went on, that eventually we're going to have to deal in some radical way with Lebanon. And then in 1982, there was one event that set off the spark and convinced Israel under Prime Minister Menachem Begin and his defense minister Ariel Sharon that it was time to smash Hezbollah and remake the Middle East. It was the assassination. Palestinian terrorists assassinated Shlomo Argov, Israel's ambassador to Britain, and within days, Israeli forces crossed the border of Lebanon and began what's called Mitzvah Shlom HaGalil, Operation Peace for the Galilee. And standing directly in their path, objective of day one, was a fortress that had already seen 8 centuries of war, Beaufort. For the soldiers of Golani's reconnaissance units, who had actually trained for many months for the task of capturing the castle, the battle was a very bloody one. It meant hand-to-hand combat, assaulting very narrow trenches that hosted heavily armed PLO terrorists in what proved to be a very costly battle. And in fact, it was a striking moment early in the war when, shortly after the battle was over, Prime Minister Menachem Begin shows up with Defense Minister Ariel Sharon, and he gives something, an impression at the front of the TV cameras. He says he gave a display of how disconnected he was from events and leadership by that stage, and how the events were on the ground being actually dictated, not by the Prime Minister, but by the Defense Minister. Because Begin said to one of the soldiers, "Tell me," he says, "did they use machine guns?" And after seeing as the Golani had lost many officers and soldiers in the assault, it was this display of disconnect that alarmed the country and was to prove to be almost a harbinger of what was about to come. Because actually what happened was that the initial Israeli assault, masterminded by Sharon, was very, very successful. They broke through within a short time. They broke through to Beirut, Israeli troops ringed and besieged Beirut, and forced Yasser Arafat and thousands of his PLO terrorists out to depart into exile in Tunisia. But things didn't exactly work out that way, because although Israel withdrew to this security zone, and the security zone essentially was patrolled by the Christian Lebanese South Lebanon Army, the SLA, which was essentially an Israeli proxy, it turned into a very, very bloody stalemate, with Hezbollah able to bog Israel down. And one of the things, the terms that came to be associated more and more with the horrific bleeding wound that was southern Lebanon, in Israeli imagination, it came to be seen as Israel's Vietnam. And the parallels were very obvious. You had the South Vietnamese army meant to be actually doing the fighting, with America just supporting it. And in reality, it couldn't do the job on its own, and America needed to get involved. And the same happened in Israel's Vietnam in the South and Lebanon. And by the 90s, it was becoming clear that even as the generations of Israeli soldiers served on Beaufort, on the fortress, it was becoming clear that the battle was not going Israel's way, because Hezbollah started using roadside bombs and anti-tank missiles and mortars that rained down on these isolated outposts. And the road leading to Beaufort became to be called the Bloody Route, Kvish Hadamim. And so this castle that had once seemed to be a symbol of Israeli triumph, became a symbol of sacrifice, and raised the wider question that was debated across Israeli society. Was the security zone protecting Israel? Or had the security zone itself become the reason that Israeli soldiers were dying? In May 2000, that story seemed finally to be over, because Prime Minister Ehud Barak ordered the withdrawal from South Lebanon. Security zone disappeared almost overnight. So did the South Lebanon army, which had fought alongside Israel for years.
And thousands of its members, including their families, fled to Israel, where some of them were received and got safe haven. Others stayed behind and had to suffer the consequences, often very bloody, under Hezbollah. And obviously, Beaufort was abandoned. Now, Israel told itself a comforting story at the time. For those who remember, that we've managed, we've got out, and we're okay. And he's done, as it were, Prime Minister Ehud Barak, as he told Israel and the world, to sort of rip the plaster off this bleeding wound. But actually, Hezbollah told another story, and it was a story that the Arab world believed, showing that Israel's withdrawal was proof that the guerrilla army could oust the much bigger, much more powerful Israel. And that lit rockets under Hezbollah. It was its leader, Nasrallah, who was killed, Baruch Hashem, a year or two ago. Well, Israel finally killed. He was the one who mocked Israel for 20 years afterwards, as he called it memorably, a spider's web. It was something that could just be taken away. Israel was as weak as a spider's web, he said. And that lit the boosters under the Iranian Axis alliance, that withdrawal from South Lebanon, and almost a few years later, the withdrawal from Gaza, that led to the buildup of the Iranian ring of steel around Israel. But even after the 2006 conflict, in which Israel and Hezbollah fought 50 days, many Israelis believed, or wanted to believe, that the Lebanon story belonged actually in the past. But then came October the 7th. For years, many Israelis had come to believe that hostile forces could be monitored. It was actually Prime Minister Ehud Barak, architect of the Israeli withdrawal from South Lebanon, who came up with a memorable image, who's called Israel a villa in the jungle. That imagery was very much resonated in the Oslo era, because Israelis came to believe that the hostile forces in the jungle, the wild animals of the jungle, surrounding the villa that was modern enlightened Israel, these forces could be monitored and deterred. And that technology would provide the warning, and intelligence would obviously provide early warning. And that in that context, geography or having enemies right up to the border did not matter, because Israel would always be able to spot a surprise attack, and overwhelming technological superiority would mean that Israel could cope with whatever the enemies threw their way. Now, there's a Hebrew word for that. It was a word that became popular after the Yom Kippur War, the intelligence failures of the Yom Kippur War, and it also returned in relation to October the 7th. That word is conceptia, like a misconception, and it means the intelligence failures that led to the Yom Kippur War and the Simchas Torah attacks. But it's actually, conceptia means something wider. It means the whole of society failure of imagination, of self-delusion, essentially, that led to both attacks. And that is why, for many Israelis, the return to Beaufort in the last few weeks has resonated, because it seems to symbolize something larger. The withdrawal from Lebanon in 2000 had once been greeted by Israelis with enormous relief, for those who remember what the feeling was back then. After nearly 2 decades of casualties, Israelis believed they were escaping their own quagmire of Vietnam. But today, in the shadow of October the 7th, with Iran's network of proxies stretching from Lebanon to Gaza, Iraq, and Yemen, many Israelis look back on that withdrawal very differently as part of the conceptia. They see it as a dreadful delusion, a period of fake calm, essentially of the entire country burying its head collectively in the sand, and Israel in general lulling itself into complacency while its enemies visibly rearmed. And that's why the image of Israeli soldiers with the flag flying once more atop Beaufort Castle is seen as so symbolic, because it seems to collapse 26 years of history into a single photograph. And that brings us back to the debate that has erupted after the fortress was captured. Because for people like Tzvika Barkai, who was a commander, who was then 24 years old, who in the middle of as his more senior officers fell in the assault of Beaufort Castle in 1982. So he's back on the news and as an analyst, And he said last week, he looks at the mountain and the castle and he says, this is nothing more than symbolic. Because he said if the battlefield has changed in an era when Hezbollah, through its drones and precision weapons, can strike deep into Israel unchallenged, physical control of terrain is not the key. So he says Beaufort is a symbolic distraction. But there's others who argue. There's a think tanker and former intelligence officer, Orna Mizrahi, who is widely quoted, says that Beaufort still commands an extraordinary view over southern Lebanon. And in other words, strategic points still matter. When you listen to this kind of debate among analysts, you're struck by the fact that actually Beaufort contains both truths. Truth number one is that geography matters. It's not for nothing that the Crusaders, and then Saladin, and then the PLO, and then Hezbollah, and IDF fought over exactly the same ridge, the same castle. And the second is that truth, which remains, these two are mutually reconcilable, is that geography alone is not enough. A fortress can dominate a valley, but it can't solve a problem of drones or of political problem, a problem in which an enemy is not deterred. King Fulk of Anjou, of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, learned that lesson. The Crusaders learned it as well, and Israel learns it and relearns it again. Beaufort's recapture raises the same questions of strategic depth versus quagmire. And that is why 44 years after the famous battle, and nearly 9 centuries after King Fulk built his frontier fortress, Israelis are still arguing about Beaufort. The flags, armies, and weapons have changed, but the mountain and its dilemma remains.
Thank you for listening to Behind the Times. We appreciate you joining us as we explore the stories and people that shape Jewish history. If you enjoy this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share with friends. Until next time.